criminal behaviourology, to assist the criminal and civil justice systems, to improve our society. A podcast like no other. Here is your host, Timothy Joseph.
Hello, this is Criminal Behaviorology. I'm your host, Timothy Joseph. Happy to have you here. Have a very good interview today. I think it's one of our best that we've done. I came across an article in the International Journal of Behavioral Consultation and Therapy, 2007, a behavior analytic perspective on victimology by Karola Dillenburger. She is a professor of behavior analysis and education and director of the Centre for Behavior Analysis in Queen's University, Belfast. She provides some insights from her 2007 article on behavior analysis and victimology. Her own experiences living in Northern Ireland supplement this often neglected side of the impact of criminality. We find that many of the same contingencies found with victims are also in place in the learning history of perpetrators. And there's a video presentation on our YouTube channel of the entire interview. So among the things we cover is what is victimology as a field of study, the main differences between victims and survivors, three key concepts: personal learning history, prevailing contingencies, and cultural context, and how these concepts factor in the development of victims and perpetrators. The importance of behavioral economics in the study of victims, closed versus open economies, transgenerational transmission of trauma, and some of these old ideas like the unconscious longing to be a victim, the lack of evidence to support this idea, and how a careful examination of the contingencies involved can dispel many of these mysterious explanations regarding victim behavior, as, for example, in domestic violence and other examples. Karola's emphasis on getting away from just the greater elaboration of words found in psychodynamic and psychological literature, and instead focus on the basics of behavior, such as what is the antecedent, what is the behavior now, behavior analysis as a means to deal with depression and bereavement, and the increased use of behavior analytic concepts in many fields. So I hope you'll enjoy the interview. Karola is a great speaker and she's a great writer, and I think this is a very important topic. So let's get right to the interview. Okay, so we're here with Professor Karola Dillenburger. Happy to have you. How are you this morning?
Thank you very much, Timothy. I'm great. I'm just delighted to be here, and thanks very much for the invitation. I'm hopefully be able to answer all your questions, and we have a good conversation.
You are speaking to us all the way from Ireland?
That's right, Northern Ireland.
Yeah, and you are what we would say is a full professor there?
That's right. I'm a professor at Queen's University in Belfast, and I'm presently working in the School for Social Sciences, Education and Social Work with a focus. My focus is on the education part, and there we have I run a Centre for Behaviour Analysis at the university with a number of behaviour analyst staff. We're small but very very lively team. We have a master's in ABA, that is a verified course sequence, ABAI verified course sequence online. And we also have a master's in autism spectrum disorders, which is a separate course that usually gets taught on campus, but at the moment we're also gone online and it works really well. So I'm planning probably to keep it deep in both on campus and online. So and we have RBT training and other open learning opportunities for autism training and so forth. So we've got a number of PhD students. Usually they're also distant learning. Full-time or part-time. Our PhDs are research-based, so they're not, you have to have some training, but it's not like a courses like in the US where you have to take courses. In our PhDs, you just get a one-to-one supervision and you do a piece of research and train to become a researcher. So that's And because we are all BCBAPs, as supervisors, we meet the BACB standards. We try to meet them so that our people can then get the little D at the end of their BCBAs.
Yeah, you're all BCBADs.
Yes, in our department, yeah.
So I was going to ask about that because I didn't. I mean, what led you to the field of ABA or applied behavior analysis? How did you get started in that field?
I've actually been from my very early training in Germany. I'm originally from Germany. I came to Northern Ireland about 40 years ago. But I did my first degree in Germany, and we had a module called behavior modification in the 70s and early 80s, and that really spoke to me very loud and clear. But I wouldn't have called myself a behavior analyst in those days. That sort of like evolved over time, just with reading more and talking to more people. And my husband is a very ardent behavior analyst, so I probably picked up a lot of things from him as well over the years. So we've worked together very closely on a number of different projects, including websites and books and chapters and papers and so forth, projects. So the area of autism has really interested me for a long time as well, especially more general disability and education. That's been because I'm a clinical psychologist by my first training. It sort of goes with that, and I've also done some work with adult mental health as a behavior analyst. So. But the area of victims and how to support victims, and also then how to understand the whole issue of victims, that really came through my own PhD work. As I said, I came from Germany and to Northern Ireland in the late 70s. For my first visit here was in 1979. And I couldn't believe that the people in Northern Ireland were actually just ordinary people, just really nice, friendly, really, really hospitable, lovely people. Because in the news in those days, it was horrendous. You would never have gone to Belfast for a visit. You know, I just sort of happened to end up there, but you wouldn't go. So I was sort of asking myself, how do they do it? How do they actually become, how are their nails not eaten down to their knuckles? And how do they not all have really severe mental health problems and depression and anxieties and all that? They were just ordinary folks, just having just lovely. And so I got an interest in that. And when I started my PhD, I was sort of thinking, well, as a psychologist, if you want to understand a general issue, you probably a good idea to start off in the extreme, right? Okay. So you can understand the extremes and then work your way back to sort of like other people. So who are the people that are most extremely affected by the troubles in Northern Ireland? And in those days, there was no data on who the people were that were being killed. There were people killed every day of the week, sometimes more than one person killed as part of the political. It was the political deliberately murdered. With bombs and shootings and so forth, and that happened every day in the news. And there was no data who these people were, but just generally speaking, these people were more or less youngish men, not teenagers, but men 25 to 35 to 45, that type of age group. And I thought, well, that type of age group very traditionally would be married men, right? Generally speaking, and so they leave behind a widow, right, when they die. So my focus was then on the widows. How do the widows cope with the fact that their husband had been deliberately and often horrendously killed by somebody who, there were stories, horrendous stories where, a knock at the door, the husband opens the door, bang, 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 in front of the kids are screeching. There were other stories where she waves him goodbye and the car explodes. Right, horrendous. And so my PhD was on the widows of violence in Northern Ireland. In fact, it's published as a book with Avebury at the time, 91 or something like that. In those days, nobody was touching that topic. Nobody was studying that. I did the field work in the mid-80s. Nobody was touching that topic. And there were very few people looking at the children. For a PhD, you have a limited amount of of time that you can do something. So I focused on the mothers. I asked them about their children, but I didn't also then go and ask the children. It was an interview and questionnaire study. So I wasn't a strict behaviour analyst in the time. I was doing the traditional research methodology. But I later went back and looked at the data that I found. It was verbal reports, but also observations, because I did some notes on observations. And I looked at them from a behaviour analytic point of view. And what do I make of these data as a behaviour analyst? And so I wrote quite a few papers on that. And the paper that you came across, I was actually then getting a grant. I had quite a good grant from the government to study how the victim support groups were working and how effective, because obviously effective intervention we were now 10, 20 years later after the Troubles had sort of finished they never really finished with the Good Friday Agreement, but the intensity had definitely reduced. And so the question was, these people have, I did a follow-up study after 30 years, and the data were very similar to the early study. The people had not really recovered from their traumatic loss. And so the research project was then on how do the victims groups that have been set up, and a lot of money had been spent on them, how effective were they actually in helping these people? And that was a very interesting study, and the paper that you came across came from that era of work, where I was looking at how do we actually understand from a behavior analytic point of view victimatology and survivors, and the difference between victim survivors, and what's the difference between the contingencies that they're exposed to, what is the difference between them and the perpetrators? Because in Northern Ireland, the perpetrators were not some ogre. They were the neighbour sometimes, or the neighbour across the divide. They were also ordinary people that had a political agenda and no other way of expressing that than, well, I'm not condoning what they were doing at all, but you know what I mean? That's how they expressed their political agenda. And what contingencies led them to do that? So that's it in a nutshell, how I came to the topic of victimatology. I mean, it's at the moment, and then we wanted to do some research on the transgenerational transmission of trauma, because obviously we have these very traumatized mothers, in my case. Most of them did not remarry in the traditional Northern Irish fashion. We did ask them around that, but many of them did not remarry. So they were single parents of kids that were also then, how did that trauma transmit across generations? And we did some work with drawings and explored that issue. And it was actually really interesting how years and years later, these kids were still drawing shootings and house fires and like deliberate arson house fires, not just accidental ones.
I was wondering about that, about the traumatic injury, that maybe you don't see it. If you just sat down and spoke with them, you wouldn't see signs of it, but there would be other subtle signs like drawings, their interests, other things would crop up to let you know that was still there.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to conflict resolution, that's when you see it as well. When you just sit with them in a peaceful, having dinner situation, it's okay. But when they come into conflict, their resort to violence would be probably a lot quicker than in other in children that have not got that background. Because it was interesting. Some of the parents were talking to their children about the trauma, and some of them didn't. And I'm trying to remember the data, because it's a good few years back that we did that study. But the talking didn't seem to make that much of a difference. I think it was more the example. And also, when you're traumatized, you parent differently. You're not the same parent as a parent who's not traumatized. Everybody is different anyway, but you know what I mean? A traumatized person has so many things to deal with themselves that maybe they can't focus on some of the children's needs to the same degree, or they deal with them slightly differently. And so parenting, being parented by a parent who is traumatized is obviously affecting what kind of experiences you have as a child.
What's life like in Northern Ireland now?
It's always I mean, there's not reports about people getting killed every week, every day of the week. That was in the early 70s and early 80s and into the 90s. That is not happening. At the moment, if somebody gets killed as a sectarian, it happens very, very rarely, and it's absolutely, everybody is completely aghast that this should happen. But underneath the surface of that, what looks like peace, is a lot of violence still happening. There's still advertisements in the television, for instance, where what they call punishment shootings are still happening, where youngsters are getting taken to, maybe they were involved with something that was not approved of, and they basically shoot into their kneecaps. So they're leaving these kids permanently disabled, either one leg or both legs, depending on your offense. These things still happen. Now, they're not really reported very much. You'd have to talk to hospital doctors to see how often that happens, but it still happens. Intimidation still happens. People are intimidated out of their houses so that they have to move if they live in the wrong area. And Belfast still has what's called the peace lines, which is basically like the Berlin Wall, only not with bricks. It's corrugated iron with barbed wire at the top, and some of them are bricks, and these walls are still very prevalent. In fact, after the Good Friday Agreement, more of these were built than there were before, and they're still there. And as a tourist, you can do a bus trip to the peace wall. You can write your name on the peace wall. They have pencils in there. They have pens in the bus. You can sign peace and love forever, and you can write on the peace wall, but they still stay, and they can't take them down.
The violence that we're seeing now, is it politically motivated, or is it more of a general has a criminal motivation, maybe for greed or territory or things like that?
Well, I mean, one of the big topics in this whole Brexit debate is obviously the border in Ireland is one of the big things that has come up in the whole Brexit debate. And the big worry is that while we have got the violence that you see is very muted compared to what it was, and it's still politically motivated, but it's more just a criminal element that is in every society. To some extent, that is shown, and they have a good excuse, have a better excuse than maybe in some societies. But and there's gangs and things like that. That's, I mean, America knows all about that, but sadly, but the danger is that through the whole Good Friday Agreement and then the whole European Union membership, it all became much of a muchness, and the link with the south of Ireland became something that was not a friction so much anymore. It was much more a natural thing. I mean, there was absolutely nothing. You could drive down in a bus or car, drive down through the whole of Ireland from the north to the south, and you would never be stopped or anything like that at all. You wouldn't even know that there was a border. The only thing that you knew that you're now not in Southern Ireland is because they work in kilometres and we work in miles. So the road signs were different, and their road signs are bilingual, English and Irish, and ours are not. So the north, they're not, or not all of them. There are areas that are bilingual, but not all of them. So the only way, that would have been the only way you would have known, oh yeah, right, we're now in the south, because I think the colour of the motorway sign is green and Belfast it's blue, or the other way around, I can't even remember. But, that type of thing, absolutely nothing to do with border controls or anything like that. And of course that now has to change with Brexit, because Southern Ireland is in the EU and we are not. And this issue, so everybody is really worried that would reignite the tensions, and certainly has already focused the minds of those that would have, where things had mellowed down. It definitely has heightened the tensions in that area completely, and so, I mean, we could talk about that. That's not our topic today. But we can talk about that for a long time.
There's still some tension. That's very interesting.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the tension is there, and I don't know how many generations it will take. That's where the transgenerational transmission is interesting, because it could take, I don't know how many generations it takes. I mean, our children, because they're sort of brought up with, my husband is from Northern Ireland, so they're sort of like fairly open-minded, and they're not really involved with any of that. But we're also living in a rural area, very rural, and compared to city kids, where the parents are still living in there's still segregated communities, very much so. Not in the rural areas so much, but in the in the urban areas, you have your Protestant and your Catholic areas, and there's the peace ones in between them.
So that helped inspire you. You wrote a behavior analytic perspective on victimology in 2007. How would, for those maybe that haven't heard of that field, how would you define victimology?
Well, it was actually quite interesting because I hadn't heard of that field either until I heard of it, and it really is the study the study around why certain people are victims of crime and how lifestyles affect the chances that a certain person will fall a victim of a crime. So I'm just looking at the official definition here. It covers a whole range of disciplines, and that's why I was really interested in, because I mean sociology, psychology, criminal justice, and so forth, law, and so forth have looked at this, and behavior analysts hadn't really looked at it so much. When I was looking at the violent bereavement from a bereavement per se, from a behavior analytic point of view with the widows in my PhD studies, this was like 30 years ago. I actually published, I submitted a paper to a journal, and the reviewers were saying, you cannot study something as complex as bereavement from a behavior analytic point of view, and turned the paper down. Right. Now, to me, that's just like a red flag to a bull when somebody tells me I can't study a certain topic, because behavior is behavior is behavior. We never don't behave. We always behave. So bereavement is behavior. It's just it's a summary label for a whole range of behaviors, and I think being a victim is the same. Being a victim or victimology is a summary label for a whole range of things.
Yeah, if we can study verbal behavior, we can study all behavior.
Yeah. And when we define behavior as behavior analysts, we define behavior as everything, the interaction of an organism with the environment, which includes everything. Public behavior and private inners and inner behaviors, and that's why we're not using the inner behaviors to explain public behaviors, because we see them as behaviors, and therefore they require explaining themselves. So victimology is a study of people who hurt others and people who are hurt by others. So that it sort of like covers not only the victims but also the perpetrators, which I think was interesting, because it gives us a view, because if we want to stop violence, we need to work from both angles, don't we?
Yeah.
I mean, there are some theories that lay the blame pretty much on the victim, that they're sort of like they're asking for it, but they're showing behaviors that show that they're vulnerable. And when you have somebody else who is likely to be a perpetrator, they pick on those kind of people that have those behaviors. We know it from child sex abuse that the vulnerability factors to becoming a victim are pretty identified in terms of unstable childhoods, broken families, poverty, all those lack of education, those kind of things make you more likely to become a victim. But that does not excuse any perpetrator actually making you into a victim.
Right. Well, if I could ask it, so theoretically we could have less criminal behavior if we have fewer people that are prone to be victims by the contingencies in their own lives. Is that? Yeah.
And the very interesting point is that actually the contingencies that make you into a perpetrator, or that lead to perpetrator behavior, are very, very similar. They are also deprivation, broken childhoods, poverty, unemployment, the same sort of. And of course addiction as well. A lot of criminal behavior is based in addictions and the needing the money to fulfill their addictions. But addiction behavior is linked to the same contingencies. So if you have a satisfying job, a happy family, and everything is going well, the chances of you becoming a perpetrator or an addict or a victim are actually lower. I mean, maybe victim, it's difficult because you don't want to put victims you're not becoming a victim because of how you behave in some sense, but certain people are more easily picked on. Especially when it comes, we know that from child sex abuse, that these kids, if you have a very balanced kid and the perpetrator is trying to groom them for sex abuse, they would very quickly see that this child can't be groomed because they're solid. They have good attachment. They have a good, they know their own boundaries, and they're not going to be touched like the way a perpetrator would groom a child. In sex abuse, the perpetrator doesn't just abuse the child; they groom the child. They maybe tell them a little bit of an iffy joke to start with. First of all, they befriend them, and then they tell them a little bit of a funny joke that is maybe not appropriate for that age group, and then a little bit blue maybe, and then they start brushing against them. Maybe if it's a girl, maybe the arm accidentally brushes against the chest, and a child that has a solid upbringing will probably respond by saying, "Hang on a minute, get off." Whereas a child who's more vulnerable maybe says nothing and gets intimidated and gets scared. And before you know it, the grooming can continue until it's actually fully fledged abuse. Well, I mean, obviously the grooming is abuse already in itself, but do you know what I mean? It's actually perpetrating an act of full abuse. And so a vulnerable child is more likely to be abused in that sense because they don't have the defenses, the defense behaviors to look after themselves.
They're not as easy a target then for those reasons as a more vulnerable child is.
Yeah. In a sense, it's a lesson also for parenting, I suppose, in some sense, because there are certain behaviors that if you are able to teach your children those kinds of behaviors, then they become. It's less likely that they're going to be abused in that sense, that's just one way of becoming a victim. Obviously, there's many other ways of becoming a victim, but as a behavior analyst, we're always talking about contingencies and behavior and how the learning history leads you to the present circumstances, and the present day contingencies lead you to do things. And we all know that sometimes we do really stupid things. Even so, we have a solid learning history and we have all the behaviors, we still end up doing stupid things. But by and large, it has we have that foundation of not being vulnerable against those things and approaches by an abuser. Does that make sense?
What are, from your paper, what are the main differences between victims and survivors? Is there a distinction there that you can elaborate on?
Yeah, that was actually quite an interesting point, because I was always thinking of victims, and until the people in Northern Ireland, the widows that I was talking to, some of them said, "I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor." And it really is about when you, as a behavior analyst, when you start seeing the two categories as being summary labels for certain behaviors. And the kind of behaviors that a victim would engage in publicly and privately are different from the kinds of behaviors that a survivor would engage in, although they might have experienced very, very similar situation of violence or whatever the abusive situation was. The way that they deal with it and the way they deal with it and integrate it into their day-to-day thinking and living would differ. And I think it's also that a person might be a victim to start with, but over the years maybe they can rephrase it. I mean, the cognitive psychologists talk about cognitive restructuring, and for behavior analysts that we have to translate that term, but it's still something is sparking off you thinking about your situation differently. And this something could be any kind of contingency. It could be that you're meeting a new partner in life, that you're meeting other people that have had the same experience or similar experiences. I remember working with a mother who had lost a son, and we were actually working with her because we were very concerned for the younger daughter. And the younger daughter was only 1 year old when the son, who was 16 at the time, was killed in a car crash. So there wasn't really a violent situation as such, and a deliberate violence. It was an accidental car crash and he was killed. But the young girl was now older and had all sorts of behavioural problems. And I was trying to deal with the behavioural problems of the younger daughter, of the young child, but also then realised that they actually stemmed from the behaviour of the mother, who was very restrictive and very, very overprotective, and for totally understandable reasons. She'd lost her son. She's not going to take any risk of losing another child. Absolutely understandable. But she was so overprotective that this young girl, who was now 9 at the time, couldn't move, she couldn't breathe, she couldn't do anything. What I did was I found a group of other mothers who had lost children suddenly and tragically, and paired her with another mother. And the two women were, I wasn't party to their meetings, but I knew that she had this event where she could meet another mother who also lost a 16-year-old under tragic circumstances, but had dealt with it differently. So while the mother that I was working with would have seen herself as a victim, the other mother had gotten to a place where she saw herself as a survivor, and she was able to help the mother that I was working with at the time to somehow come to that point herself 8 years later, that she said, it happened, it was tragic, it was terrible, terrible. But, we now need to look at a young girl, and we need to help her become, grow up in a healthy way, and not as restricted, because, that restriction was just horrendous. The child couldn't do anything, But, and so I think it's a life event that maybe happens. Maybe some people can do that on their own because they have the foundations in their behaviors and their upbringing and their contingencies and their learning history that will lead them not automatically, but will lead them from a victim to a survivor without anybody else again. But other people might be able, with a life event such as meeting somebody, or some other life event, maybe another horrendous incident that says, right, I've had enough of this. I'm going to really make, I know some people that have had a heart attack, their life changes completely because they're saying, right, it could happen again tomorrow. I could be gone tomorrow. I'm going to spend all my money. I'm going to go on all the holidays. I'm going to do you know what I mean? Not recklessly, but I'm not going to save money and watch this and that and the other and try to be careful. I'm just going to live my life to the full. And so there could be incidents like that could change somebody from a victim to a survivor.
Well, in that example that you gave, if the daughter, as she was so restricted, let's say she ran away from home, and it was not as traumatic as the event but it was enough that you would see the opposing side of that problem, and that may change her into more of a survivor at that point.
Yeah. Or there's also a really interesting phenomenon when it comes to bereavement and grief and victimization is a delayed grief. It's experienced often whenever I was coming across that in my research when say for instance a woman is married to a soldier and the soldier goes out into the field and it's very, very dangerous. Lots of people get killed, and she's at home with the kids and she is arranging her life, half obviously fearing but also half expecting that he may not return. So that she's already grieving, although he's not dead, but he could be dying, and it's pretty likely that he does. So she's making her life already, she's standing her own ground, looking after the kid. And when he then comes back, and he didn't die, and he comes back, it actually, a phenomenon is that very often that marriage is doomed. It's very, very interesting that because she's already got... So, she's probably in the first instance delighted that he didn't die and delighted to have him back. But ultimately, where does he fit in? She can cope. Do you know what I mean? She's been a single mother for these 2 kids or 3 kids or whatever, coping just fine. Obviously not just fine, but you know what I mean? She's been able to do it. And he comes in and he wants to be the man in the family again. And she says, hang on, I've been doing this without you. What are you doing here? It's a very complicated, the whole issue. And the other issue is also when a couple loses a child, and that trauma of losing a child, often the marriages also don't survive that. And that to me was a very interesting phenomenon because it's so sad. It's so sad. And when a couple loses a child, it must be just the most horrendous thing anybody can experience. And then whenever you have lost somebody, you need support. The person should support you. Whenever we all have lost our parents. I've lost both of my parents, and my partner, my husband, is there for me. And when he lost his dad, I was there for him because I had lost my father-in-law, but not as intense as when I lost my own father. So I'm there as a support. But when you both lose a child, who's going to support you? Because you're both in this extreme need of support And so, I mean, I would advise people to please go and find outside support, because this is just too much. You can't do it.
They're both different people after something. Both parents have now become different people after something like that.
Absolutely, and there's. Yeah, you can go to come. I mean, some people grow together really tightly after this kind of experience, but sadly, many people just don't get that. Because it must. I don't know what it takes to actually be able to do that, to grow together more tightly when that actually happens, and oftentimes, of course, there's other children involved as well who also need support.
Yeah,
because they've lost a sibling.
So what you've talked about kind of blends into you had three key concepts of the development of victims and perpetrators. You've actually talked about the personal learning history, the prevailing contingencies, and the cultural contexts. So of those three, so we probably talked a little bit about personal learning history in some of what you said. So there's prevailing contingencies and cultural context. How does that fit in with the victims and perpetrators?
Yeah, it's really those are the three areas as a behavior analyst that when we try and explain behavior, that's the three areas we look at in the first instance. There's loads more we can look at, but these are the key ones. If you sort of like behavior analysis 101, that's where you go. Prevailing learning history, prevailing contingencies, and meta contingencies. As you say, we've talked about the learning history and the behaviors that you actually have when you are that you've learned by the time you become a victim, by the time that situation arises. And then, of course, it depends. The prevailing contingencies, first of all, what actually happened? What actually happened in the situation where you became a victim? What was the situation? Was it like the Northern Irish widows? Somebody actually deliberately killed your husband? One of the questions that I asked them was, did you see it? Or were you told? Right? One of the women had been in hospital, and she actually saw it on the news that a car bomb had gone off, and she saw the pictures of the car, and she recognized it to be her husband's car. Right? That is horrendous. But there was quite an interesting point, the difference between the people that were there and saw this absolutely horrendous incident happening in front of their eyes, and the people that were told. And I went back to Skinner thinking about the rule-governed versus contingency-shaped behavior, right? So contingency-shaped behavior is really when you're in the contingencies and you're experiencing it fully, whereas the rule-governed is obviously when you're told. Because in the assessment that I've used it just as a traditional assessment tool, but a psychological assessment tool, and the people that had been there when the husband had got killed scored lower in the scores than the people that were told. So in traditional way, that the idea was that they had coped better with it than the people that had been told. And so the idea of contingency shaped versus rule-governed behavior actually fitted really well, because we know that contingency shaped behaviors are much more solid and much more resistant to extinction and all those kind of things than rule-governed behavior is. So it fitted in quite well. Obviously, you would wish it on your worst enemy to see these things, but in the longer term, by the time I got to ask these widows the questions, about 10 years later, they actually scored lower in the scores, which to me was quite intriguing. That lower score wasn't consistent 20 or 30 years later. That seemed to be, I don't know what went on there, but there seemed to be a slight difference. But of course, you're talking about post-traumatic stress and all those kind of things as well. But so what actually happened when the traumatic incident happened? Where you like in the research I did with the widows in Northern Ireland, that was the situation. But it really depends on the circumstance. One other interesting point was I asked them retrospectively about the happiness in their marriage, which is a bit of a dodgy question, but it was still interesting. I asked them, did you think you were really happy, or were you sort of like, yeah, okay, or was it really a complicated marriage? And the people that were really happily married, you'd sort of think like they miss their husband the most, but they actually scored lower in the scores as well. I mean, they all scored way above average, but they, relatively speaking, to the people that had a conflicted marriage, they seem to find it even more difficult to deal with the loss of the husband because they never got a chance to resolve any of those conflicts. That's not behavior analytic anymore. I was talking about that, but it does make sense to have a situation, in present circumstances, where there are conflicts to be resolved, and they didn't get resolved because the husband is now dead. They can't do it. That the people that you sort of expect to miss the husband more because they had a happy marriage, I suppose in a non-behavioral way, they can look back and sort of say, well, at least we've had those happy years. And so that's where the actual circumstance of what happened makes a difference. Right? And then cultural contingency, meta contingencies are obviously also very important, because in the Northern Ireland situation, by the time I got to speak to these widows, we were talking about 85, 86. The Troubles had started in 1969. So the incidence of people dying that had become the norm in the news. Right? There were people dying every day, getting killed, not dying natural causes. There were people getting killed. And 5 or 6 days of the week, there was in the news report somebody had got killed in the Troubles. Right? Now, the total number of people killed was just over 3,600 in all of those years. So looking back now on COVID and the towers in New York, and that doesn't seem that many, but it's a lot. It's a lot. And if it's constant, 1 or 2 people killed in the Troubles every single day.
I was going to say the ongoing nature of it.
Yeah. And of course, then once the TV has got a picture of your loved one who got killed, they use that over and over again.
Yeah.
Right? So you're sitting here watching the news and something happened, and the next thing your husband appears on the screen. So you're never allowed to actually somehow, get that sorted out in your head. Do you know what I mean? Because the stimuli are presented to you at all times. But then the cultural contingency of that happening, and then actually your husband does get killed. He is actually now going to be one of those pictures that appears again and again. Yeah. It's very different when it happens now in the cultural contingencies that we're experiencing now in Northern Ireland. If somebody gets killed as part of the political is there's political motivation behind killing, that person is totally out of the blue. It's completely like everybody's just stunned. In the mid-'80s, people were not stunned. I mean, people were stunned if there were 8 people killed at the same time. That happened 8 or 9 people. There was a couple of incidents where like a lot of people were killed. That was sort of still, people were saying, oh my God, what happened there? But if one person, sometimes that wasn't even reported in the news. That was just what happened every day.
Nowadays, the small mass murders don't make big news. You have to have large numbers of killings. Large groups of people are killed. That becomes, I think it used to be just 3 or 4 people, it was big news. It was a horrible event. But now, something has shifted.
It's terrible, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's terrible. It's like the murders were I don't know. Murdering was reinforced at the top of the extinction burst. You just have to kill more people before you get in the news. This is terrible. It's really, really bad. I keep thinking, why do they even report? Well, of course they have to report those kinds of things. But one of the incidents, I can't remember when it was, there was a big drive not to ever mention the name of the person who committed the offense. It was said, like, do not mention his name. It was him. Do not mention his name ever. Mention all the names of the victims, of the people that were killed. Mention all of their names, but do not show his pictures, do not anything. Completely blank him out. And I think that would make sense. Because we know somebody did it. We don't need to know who that was. We could... Because that publicity is
it's reinforcing. ABAI had a couple discussions on that, about going to the media about how they should handle these cases, and they gave that same kind of stop putting their pictures up there, their life story, and all that kind of thing, so that it would not be reinforcing for the next case that would come along. And all
the copycat stuff.
The copycat effect. So this is interesting. How are behavioral economics important in the study of victims? Can you speak a little bit about the open and closed economy, and how's that distinction matter?
Yeah, I'm just trying to, let me see. I suppose it really depends on the availability of the reinforcers. For it fits in what we've just talked about. Because if the reinforcers, like this is the reinforcers for the perpetrators now, when we're talking about that, if they're available, like a news report, like publicity at all times, then it might actually happen more often. Whereas maybe if the reinforcers are not available, as we've just said, if they are becoming not named, the pictures are not in newspapers, nobody really wants to know about them, then it becomes less reinforcing. I mean, it's a difficult one because I think it's not just it would take us back to the prevailing contingencies really, whereas I think some of the perpetrators, it's really more in their learning history that the explanation lies. The prevailing contingencies, okay, they offer the opportunity to perpetrate that act, and oftentimes that's obviously planned. But I think ultimately the reason for their behavior is more in their learning history, and whether they have had those vulnerability factors that are making people more likely to become a perpetrator or a victim.
So you had written the open economies are those where the reinforcers are available at all times during the experimental situation as well as outside the experiment, while in closed economies the reinforcer is only available during the experimental situation. And so that experimental results show that of this differentiation show that behavior in open economies is weaker, more flexible, and less resistant to change than behavior in closed economies that is usually strong, relatively inflexible, and resistant to change. So those two types of economies change the flexibility of the behavior.
Yeah, and I think the resistance to change as well, because I mean, ultimately, as a behavior analyst, we believe in that people's behavior can be changed if you expose people to the right contingencies, to the right learning experiences. We hope that people can change, and I think that's an important question. Can a perpetrator of violence change? Can they be brought to a point where they see that their behavior is not really getting them the results, and that there are better ways to get the results than hurting other people. It's sort of like it gets us a little bit to the whole smacking debate as well. We've done some work on the smacking debate where like where people sort of say, no, you need to smack kids to show them what's right and wrong. But that's violence towards children, isn't it? That's perpetrating violence on a child. That, like, a big strong adult smacking a child is just not really fair and right. And the point would be to teach people that there are other ways and better ways. That if you don't want to smack a child, that doesn't mean to say that you don't want them to stick to rules and follow instructions. But there are better ways to teach them that. And I think this distinction between open and closed economies, it's a little bit difficult to implement in real life. But as you say, ABI is trying to get speaking to media, for instance, because I think they have a big role to play in whether this is an open or closed economy for perpetrators that are looking for, I'm sure not every perpetrator is looking for publicity, but they're looking for something. People perpetrate an act of violence for something. The problem is that if it's just to get money, say it's a theft, and they knock somebody out to thieve and to steal the money, the immediacy of that reinforcer is a problem, really, because in that particular circumstance, because they get the money and run. They have the money now. And oftentimes, even if they get caught later on, by that stage, they have already, first of all, they've got the money, and second, they probably have purchased whatever they wanted to purchase with that money, be it drugs or a drink or whatever. And then maybe a week later, if they get caught, and oftentimes probably they don't, but if they do get caught, by that stage, it's already, the reinforcer is already there and has reinforced that behavior. So the chances of them, even if they lose their freedom for some time, that immediacy. I mean, it's sort of, brings us back to this this whole question of the skills of working with delayed reinforcers as well, doesn't it? I mean, we know a lot about that, and we should teach kids to be able to stick it out and wait for a reinforcer and be able to respond appropriately to delayed reinforcement. We know that young kids can't do that very well, so it's something that you need to learn over a lifetime. You know, those experiments where they give them 1 sweet now or 2 sweets later.
Marshmallow test, yeah.
Yeah. So we know that, you know, younger kids, they take the 1 sweet now, and then some kids always, all their life, take the 1 sweet now, even as adults. And it is a skill that would be a target behavior, I think, for child rearing, to teach kids, like, sometimes it's a good idea to just wait and you know, save up. Like, you know, we did sort of like gave the kids quite early, gave them a tiny little bit of pocket money, but also showed them how to save the pocket money for a bigger thing that they might wanted to you know, and teaching them to save money, to wait. I mean, sometimes having siblings is great. We had twins. They learned waiting very, very early on, because you can only change one nappy at a time.
You're right. Yeah, that's true. So yeah, so we're teaching the children, teaching them the skill of being able to tolerate delays, as opposed to the smacking or immediate punishment for a bad behavior that is always reactive.
Yeah, I mean, to teach kids how to behave well, I mean, there's so many behavioral methods we can use, from all the differential reinforcement stuff, right to just reinforcing the. I mean, as in the very first thing that you say to parent training, you say catch them being good.
Yeah,
you know, it's that sort of like, you can teach them by catching them being good. They can't be good and bad at the same time. Bad, meaning they are unwanted behavior. You know, they can't do the both of them at the same time. Teach them the good behaviors that you want them to engage in. And I remember a friend of mine wanted to have her daughter being sort of really free and easy, and they had a game playing, and they were sitting, the two of them, with a very, very small child, they were sitting in the car, says, you can use any words you want, you can use all the, and then she started a whole litany of curse words, and the wee 2-year-old was just copying her, and she later wondered why her child used curse words. Like, duh, you know, if you don't want a child to learn behaviors, don't teach them.
Yeah, that's straight out imitated you, so.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you know, it's like anything else. If you don't want a behavior, don't teach it in the first place, and teach alternatives, better alternatives. Teach. And I think the delay of reinforcement is for our discussion on victims and perpetrators is an important one, because that's one of the skills that I think perpetrators are often lacking.
Yeah. Well, so since we mentioned like the open economic system, I was just thinking of the what we would think of as the random crime in large cities, that you can easily, the anonymity of it, you can commit a mugging or a theft and then get away. And then when you have more and more people doing that, there's a lot of that going on. It's a lot of easy reinforcement, especially if you need the money or whatever, you have an establishing operation. There's a lot of reinforcement that's easily it's easy to come by in that environment. And the copycat as well, then, and the anonymity and the immediacy of the reinforcer, that you get the money immediately, or you whatever you're stealing. I mean, even shoplifting. You know, you walk out of the shop and you have the item immediately there. I suppose, in a sense, that's more likely where there's crowded places. There's also the temptation in inner cities where shops are, you know, available. If you're living out in the country like we do, we have fields and cows. There's very little you can steal. You know, so it's probably for pickpocket, we would be there would be much less opportunities in a rural area than there would be in a larger. And you've also got, in a larger city, and you've also got the community ties where there's more control over your behavior in rural areas than there would be in urban areas, because everybody knows everybody else. And if you commit a crime in a rural area, somebody's bound to know you. You know, your face is known, and somebody will be able to say, oh, I know that person, that's so-and-so's son, or that's...
such and such a cousin.
It's much more closed in that sense because if there's somebody from outside the community there, that in itself becomes recognized. It's like, oh, I've never seen him before. So
yeah.
So if you're going to try and do
Absolutely.
something there, you don't have that anonymity anymore.
Yeah, and in the inner city, you don't even know your own neighbors oftentimes in the top block. You know, it's the question is really then, as a behavior analyst, what can we do to prevent these perpetrators, and what can we do to support victims to become survivors? And later on, I suppose once you've been victimized, and even if you become a survivor, that's an experience that you can't take away. That's part of your learning history now. That's going to stay. But how do you deal with it? One of the concepts I came across, and again, it's a concept not from the behavioral literature, but from the non-behavioral literature, and it's called, Jesus, I had it a minute ago. It's adversarial growth, which is, I think, is a really interesting concept, because it means that in the face of a difficult situation, be it an abusive situation or where you become a victim, you actually grow. It probably takes a longer time. It doesn't happen immediately, but people that have had difficult experiences have grown. Like I know a colleague who lost a child, and tragically lost a child, and is grieving heavily about this, but has grown to develop a system where they're now helping other children in similar situations, or parents who fundraise. A child died with cancer, and they now become big fundraisers for childhood cancers. You know, they're making the best out of a terrible situation, but they're actually growing as people. They're learning, and I mean, in less tragic situations, it's easier to understand if you're sort of like coming through a divorce, and your second marriage then becomes particularly happy because you know you've made all the mistakes, you've grown as a person, you maybe become a little bit more flexible and a little bit more forgiving. The little niggly things don't niggle you anymore because you're something that's unimportant. The big things matter. So you're growing as a person through an adversarial, through a bad situation. And I think that's quite an interesting topic, because as behavior analysts, it's one of those, I quite like those topics that makes a lot of sense, but how does a behavior analyst analyze that? Because this is human behavior. Where does that fit in? And motivating operations always help a long way to sort of, whenever there's a big switch in something, you sort of thinking, what was the motivating operation that made you from a victim to a survivor to somebody who's actually grown through the not adversarial, but through the negative experience. And can we actually facilitate those kind of motivating operations for people that haven't done that journey, haven't come through that journey? You know, what is the journey that people go through? That what is the learning history that brings people from this A to B? And what can we learn to help other people who are finding it more difficult to make that journey? Are there lessons to be learned? Are there contingencies that can be arranged? And one of the things in my thinking about the bereavement and the extinction burst that happens with bereavement, especially with the widows, when your husband dies, all the behaviours that he would have reinforced for the widow are not going to be reinforced anymore, right? Because he's not there to do it. So his responses would have reinforced certain behaviours, and they're not there anymore. So so you go through you see an extinction burst, and that's where Murray Parks and people like that talk about the bereavement, stages of bereavement and stuff like that. We look at that as an extinction burst, go through that. And the question is really, and then the behaviours fade. The ones that are not reinforced anymore, they obviously fade out. And then there's new behaviours come in that are being reinforced by other people, by other people's responses. And the question is really, should we do anything to help somebody over this extinction burst? Should we try and make that quicker? Or should we just let it run its path? Because if somebody then if behaviours get reinforced at the top of that extinction burst, we're in trouble. Right? So are there methods that we should try and help somebody who's bereaved and who's a victim through that extinction burst more quickly, or should we just let it run? I mean, not that we have the power over deciding that, but just theoretically speaking, Because if we make it too short, that's not good. We can't rush grief, because that's basically what you would talk about. There is a time aspect to this, but on the other hand, if it's too long, like that mother I was talking about, there was 8 years of a curve. That's too long, because it was affecting everything else around her. And it's a question I don't have the answer to that. It's just, I think it's a fascinating question whether an extinction burst should be the process of extinction should be just let run, or should it be encouraged to pass quicker. Because then you have the spontaneous recovery, which I would have aligned with anniversaries and things like that, where all of a sudden the whole impact of the grief comes back again. Anniversaries, Christmas, that type of thing, where depending on which way you're celebrating, it's maybe not Christmas, but some celebration like that, where usually all the family is together and your loved one is not there. It becomes more obvious that they're not there.
So could it be said, the widow has lost someone, they lost all these reinforcers, that sets up an establishing operation where they need something, they may need economic benefits or supports or someone to talk to, and then they start doing all these other behaviors in response to that. Could be destructive for them.
Could be, absolutely.
And
it's basically whenever somebody, when a behavior is put on extinction, you find that there's a lot of replacement behaviors, a lot of variability of behaviors occurs. All sorts of stuff happens, right? Because you're not necessarily immediately, we know that from symptom substitution kind of research. You wouldn't have, that's why we don't put behaviors on extinction without replacement behaviors in interventions. Extinction is the last thing we'll do. We focus in on the alternative behavior and reinforce that through differential reinforcement of whatever. Our focus is on what should they do, not what they should not do, right?
Yeah.
But in bereavement, it's not so planned.
Right.
It's just these behaviors are put on extinction unplanned. It just happens. Yeah. So there will be these replacement behaviors, this variability of behaviors that will just come out. They'll do all sorts of things, and then it depends on what of those behaviors are being picked up and reinforced, and which ones aren't. And those ones that are picked up by, like the environment, other people reinforcing, reinforcers being provided through their environment, through other people, socially or whatever. Those are the behaviors that then maintain. So a widow will, after the bereavement, will be a changed person. Not only, people say, of course she's changed, she's a widow now, but behaviorally speaking, Beth Sulza-Azaroff has some lovely work in this field. When she lost her first husband, she's describing very, very nicely how, I can't remember the exact example now, it was 1999, a paper, I think was it in Java or the Behaviour Analyst, I'm not sure, where she describes that music stopped for her. She just lost interest in music, but gardening came up. Or it was the other way around. I can't remember exactly now, but it was really interesting how she said one of the things that she used to love to do with her husband just stopped being of interest to her. She couldn't do it. It was just gone. So the effectiveness of that reinforcer, in a sense, it was an abolition of the death of him was an abolishing operation for that particular reinforcer. That just couldn't happen anymore. The memories were too, I don't know what, too harsh. But something else came up as a reinforcing activity that replaced it. And in her case, obviously, it wasn't aberrant. It was something that was also suitable to do. And she also said something that was really interesting and quite hard to get your head around. She started dating quite quickly. Right? And because she saw that if she must have been quite young at the time, relatively young at the time, she had no interest in dating. She just made dates, right? She says, I need to practice this behavior. She wasn't going to go out with anybody in particular early on, but she realized that there were behaviors was going on, different behavior were going on extinction, were put on extinction. Other behavior had to be shaped up. And dating and socializing were these kinds of behaviors that needed to be shaped up. And she just made herself go out on dates with people, I don't know exactly who, maybe they were already acquaintances or whatever. Do you know what I mean? she made herself, and she says at the beginning it felt all wrong and it felt all horrible and everything else, but in time it became the behavior, and it was reinforced. And in time, well, obviously she met somebody else and remarried. So over time, that actually as a strategy and as a behavior analyst, I just thought, oh my God, here's a woman who thinks behaviorally about her own bereavement.
Yeah.
I just thought that was amazing.
Very insightful.
Abigail Calkin did another really nice piece of work in this field where she I don't know if you know Abigail, Alaskan behavior analyst. She's also an author of novels and poetry. And so she ran writing classes, and all of a sudden she found that she couldn't write, and there were two other participants in her classes, and she did precision teaching. She did word counts and everything else in her writing classes. And the word count just dropped out. The data in her sheets just, oh my God, where the count's gone? They're just gone bottomed out. For three of them, herself and two other people, the word count just bottomed out. And she looked into it, and the three of them had suffered a bereavement.
Oh.
And the word count just dropped out while they were suffering, immediately after the bereavement, different kinds of bereavements of whoever a relative had died. But the word count dropped out completely, and only to recover very slowly eventually again. I thought that was fascinating. Again, a behavior analyst to think about that. And at the time when I was doing that work, Don Bear had just died, and we were all in absolute shock of Don Bear dying. And I thought we should all measure our behavior, missing Don. And I mean, some of us knew him personally and others didn't, but he influenced all of us.
Right.
And it was just, I remember giving a paper at a conference, dedicating it to him, and sort of thinking, we should measure our behavior now that we've lost Don. And I didn't know him personally. I'd met him met him at a conference. We'd had lunch together, and he wrote a forward for one of our books, really insightful. And there was a feeling of connection, although I didn't actually know him that well, but a sincere feeling of loss. And I thought we should all measure some behavior. Something must be measurable that has happened. Because if we don't, as behavior analysts, measure our own behavior in these situations, we can't ask other people to give us their data.
Yeah. Well, this behavioral view, it seems like it could be very enlightening on the whole idea of trauma or traumatic injury. Because so here we're talking about the loss of some routine reinforcer or just a reinforcer of some type, and then whatever efforts are made to replace that is what we see as the effect of the traumatic injury. And it could be good or bad things. It could be turning to alcohol or drugs, or just escape, hiding away from, and we might call that depression. But it just seems like a fuller view of what could be happening when we say someone has been traumatized.
Yeah. I think it's. I always like to look at these from a clinical psych point of view. You have all these different concepts and different complex diagnoses in your head, and you come across them. But I like to go back to basics when it comes to behavior analysis and sort of say, before we do it in a parsimonious sense, before we start getting a very complicated explanation, this is where the psychodynamic. I mean, my college in Germany was very psychodynamic, and the explanations were getting more and more complicated and bigger. The words became bigger and bigger and longer. And this was explained by this, and it became a massive big tower of big long words that just did not make sense to me at all. So I'm thinking, I want to go right back down to the bottom of it, right back down to the contingencies. And that's where the three aspects of learning history, prevailing contingencies, and cultural contingencies come into it. That's our bottom line. Let's go back there. And once we have exhausted everything we know on that level, then let's find out that we need to go up a higher level. And that's fine. If we need more, we need more. I'm certainly not thinking that we've discovered everything there's to be discovered about behavior. I think there's way more to behavior than we already know, and we know quite a bit. But I reckon there are behavioral principles that we haven't even got dreamt of. Because a while back nobody thought about derived relations. Now everybody talks about them. nobody was talking about functional analysis a while back, and now it's totally the run of the mill, thanks to the various researchers that brought us to that point. I reckon somebody else will come up with something that we sort of say, oh, right, never thought of that. That's good. And it's purely behavioral. It's not going up into some mentalistic over mountain that we that the psychodynamic people would lead us into, where you sort of talk about all sorts of things, and their concepts and their ideas are really, really good. I mean, I would love behavior analysis of transference. Wouldn't that be fun?
Transference and counter-transference, yeah. That there's some kind of...
Let's do behavior analysis because it's behavior. If it happens, it's human. If it happens, it's human behavior. If it happens, if an organism interacts with the environment and this is the result, then we are up for it. But but I would like to start at the bottom first, on the basics. Back to basics.
Well, on that note, then, is there in your paper you talked about some traditional researchers, the idea of an unconscious longing to be a victim, or I think it was Wolfgang, the idea that the victim somehow fed the crime. Does that have any validity, or what is your response to that?
It makes me really, really annoyed.
Yeah.
Because it really tries to excuse. It's a bit like that domestic violence thing where she was asked, rape. She was asking for it. She was wearing a short skirt. I mean, for goodness sake, if a woman can't wear a short skirt, if that's what she wants to do, that is not an excuse for anybody to do anything bad to her. That's like we were talking about the vulnerabilities and the vulnerability behaviors and the life experiences and the contingencies that have led you to be. To engage in behaviors that make you more vulnerable to becoming either a victim or a perpetrator. That's where I would start with. Because whenever those kind of other theories come up, the traditional theories, they end up as some sort of mentalistic explanation. And we can't go down that road because that means you're putting the blame for the victim inside the victim, the explaining of the behavior. You explain the behavior of the victim from within the victim, and that's not where the explanation lies as a behavior analyst. Never, right? The explanation is always in the contingencies. It's never inside the person. What's inside the person needs explaining. So if you want to explain what's inside the person, then you need to look at the contingencies that led to that behavior. Because if our feelings and cognitions and our desires and all the stuff that goes on inside of us, if that's defined as behavior, well, then it's the contingencies led there. Because they weren't there when we were born. The way I look at it, I was born in Germany, right? I now think and dream in English. I didn't. It's learned behavior. I didn't think and dream in German when I was born either. That was learned behavior. But here's a very easy, very straightforward example how over the last 40 years, out of whatever many I've been around on this planet, the first 20 odd, I was thinking and dreaming in German, and now I'm thinking and dreaming in English. So it's clearly a learned behavior. Both of them are learned behaviors, thinking and dreaming. Right? And had I been born in Yugoslavia, or had I been born in, I don't know, in Poland or some other place, I would think and dream in that language.
Yeah, you would follow the contingencies of that environment.
Yeah. I mean, so a victim wanting to be a victim is not explaining anything. It's not explaining why the perpetrator has actually done it. A perpetrator being looking out for certain behaviors, vulnerable kind of behaviors. That's one thing. But a victim behaving in behaviors that are sending out signals that they're vulnerable does not mean to say they should be abused. They should be protected.
Well, I've had a couple episodes and some guests on the subject of domestic violence, and that really does bring up, because I don't. We see this idea of, well, does the person want to be do they want to be in a domestic violent situation? It can be very frustrating for family members, for friends, for the police, when someone keeps going back to that situation. And sometimes the relationship ends and they start a new one, and then that becomes a domestic violence situation.
Yeah.
So that I don't, that unconscious longing to be a victim, I don't think that is the case, but I see where that perception comes from, because they don't have any other explanation. They know something's going on here, but they don't have any other explanation unless they have a behavioral view based on environmental contingencies.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the longing to become a victim, that's a mentalistic explanation for behavior, and so we can't go there. That's not what's explaining the behavior. We need to explain why do they have that longing? Even if that longing would be an appropriate summary label, even if it were an appropriate summary label, that's all it is. It doesn't mean anything. It would be a summary label that requires explaining, and the only way to explain it is how come they have that longing, if you want to call it that, right? How did they get there? They weren't born that way. It's not genetic. Right? It's a learning history that got them there. And how can we prevent that learning history? Because I mean, for instance, in domestic violence, if the abusive partner holds all the cards or has all the reinforcers, right? And the person thinks that the person has no experience of getting reinforcers elsewhere, better reinforcers, for better behaviors, then the example that you said, where a person then maybe leaves that relationship and goes into another relationship and that is also abusive, that happens. But it also happens that they go into another relationship and it's not abusive, and all of a sudden, oh my God, relationships can be like this. I mean, and it's a really good relationship, and they're finding that there are reinforcers out there to be had that are not abusive, and that the abuser actually didn't hold all the cards. But if you're brought up in a vulnerable situation with a learning history where you may be a wee bit downbeat and you didn't really get a lot of reinforcers for the right kind of behaviors as a child, maybe a bit of neglect, poverty, social deprivation going on, that type of thing. Now, that doesn't mean to say that that's the only way to get there.
Right.
There are affluent people that are in abusive relationships and can't get out as well.
Right.
But we can. It really is. I suppose the nice thing about behavior analysis is that ultimately it depends on the individual. You can make generalized statements, but ultimately the proper analysis has to be on an individual basis. Your learning history, your present circumstance, your cultural contingencies. I can't explain any behavior unless I have a really good insight of those things. And then we can talk about your learning history and what has brought you to this point where you are staying in abusive relationships. Let's have a look where that came from for you. There are probably some general principles, which are some general ideas, which makes it a bit more likely. But ultimately, you may or may not have experienced those. We can only talk about and that's what I really like about behavior analysis. It's so individually tailored. It really depends on the person, and it, as a clinical psych, it speaks to me as well so much, because when you want to help people, you have an entry from in a lot of the others here in the way I was brought up into psychodynamic stuff. I ended up like making bigger and bigger words, but not really knowing where to start helping this person. Whereas if I go back and sort of say, forget about all those big words, let's just talk about the behavior. What happened today, and what happened yesterday, and what happened? What's the consequence of your behavior? What was the antecedent of your behavior? Do your ABCs, have a look at those, see what you can do, go right back to basics and work from there. And if you need something more complicated, we've got it. But let's start with the easy stuff first. What are the contingencies? It's an extinction curve, motivating operation, So that's how we looked at the bereavement stuff. And when we were told behavior analysts can't look at bereavement, we just went into it. And we're not, as I say, Sol Sazarov and Abigail Calkin, there's a couple of people that did it, and I think it's now more and more, especially with the COVID stuff, there's more research in this area coming along, which is good.
And perhaps the behavioral viewpoint ends up being the most non-judgmental viewpoint you're looking at the individual, but it's not something it's their learning history and present contingencies is what we're really looking at.
Yeah. I mean, if any of your listeners are interested, we've just finished a web page with a lot of this kind of stuff. We call it Behaviour Analysis, a primer, with the behaviour spelled with the U for the English spelling, It's just behaviouranalysis.eu.com. So maybe you could put that up. Mickey Keenan and Karola Dillenburger, that's my husband and me. We've had this iBook as a long time as an iBook, and then people couldn't access it because they couldn't access iBooks. So we now have it on a free web page. And there's a lot of that whole thing about looking at mentalism and just priming some ideas with lots of links to existing resources as well, like on YouTube. But a lot of animations that we made and a lot of explanations. So that might be a nice place to start. It's not focused on victimology specifically, it's behavior analysis generally. But I think if you go back to the basics where behavior is the interaction of an organism with the environment, then you look at it behaviorally and there's so much to be had. And the more complex the concepts are that we're looking at, the more interesting it gets, because, to get your head around. There's some lovely paper. Somebody wrote a nice paper some years ago on intimacy. It's lovely. I think it was Behaviour Analyst. I don't know. Did you see it?
I've seen stuff like that before on relationships and things. Yeah. And Mark Mataney, he's really good at that kind of stuff as well. He's written some lovely stuff. So we're right in there, and these are areas that behaviour analysis can offer a lot. In other areas where our stuff has already gone so far into the general knowledge base that they don't even talk about behavior analysis anymore. I mean, everybody knows about positive reinforcement, right? Right.
I'm really into the ponies and the horses, and it's just they say, "Oh, I'm using R plus." It's just there's nothing, it's not even. Are you using R plus? I'm using R plus. Yeah. So positive reinforcement, and then the question is, should we be? There's nobody talking about behavior analysis. They're just saying, we're using R plus in that training. And it's really interesting to see that from the behavior analyst's point of view, and they're quite knowledgeable. Yeah. And some people are very knowledgeable, and then you have some behavior analysts who put their pennies worth into that area as well.
It's become part of the lexicon then. Effectively. Well, this has been great, Karola. It's really told us a lot. I like this perspective. If you're interested. Maybe we can interview you again sometime, because it just seems like there's so much to this. The more we talk about it, the more there is to it. But
absolutely. Yeah, I'd like that. It was very. Thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed that too, and it's always nice to talk to somebody who is interested in to other behavior analysts, because there's so much anti-ABA stuff going on that we sometimes it's just people. If they understand ABA properly, if they understand behavior analysis properly, but there's so much misinformation out there about what we do and what we don't do. And I'm sort of thinking, look, ask somebody who's actually trained in the science before you start judging, because you wouldn't judge any other scientists without actually understanding the science a little bit more. Yeah. I think our subject matter is the problem, because everybody thinks they know about behavior.
Right. Yeah.
You don't need to study a science to know about behavior. Everybody knows about behavior.
We're not misunderstood. We're just not understood at all, because they don't know the general principles that we're trying to use. So.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Thank you so much, and hopefully we can be in touch, and maybe we could do this again in the near future.
Okay. All the best.
All right. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day, Karola.
You too, Timothy. Okay.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
This has been Criminal Behaviourology. Check us out on podomatic.com or anchor.fm. Please send questions, comments and requests for transcripts to criminalbehaviourology@gmail.com.